Good morning, church. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 this morning, and one of Apostle Paul's big goals in this chapter is to teach the Christians there how to think and love like Christ. And so in chapter 8, he gives an example of loving your weaker brother by giving up your liberties for their sake. And here in chapter 9, he actually gives an example of him doing that for the sake of preaching the gospel. And so Paul here gives 4 strong reasons why he has these rights, and then he explains why he lays all of them down. And so 4 reasons why Paul has Christian liberties and the right to basically make a wage for what he does is he says, aren't we at least entitled to what all the other apostles and ministers are entitled to? Or is it just me and Barnabas that shouldn't make anything from our living? Second, he gives examples of a farmer or a shepherd or a planter, and he says everyone works so that they may receive a benefit from it. This is just in the fabric of the way that God's designed the world. And so should we be the only ones that can't do that? 3, he actually goes to the law and he says, doesn't the law itself say this? He says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it's treading. And so who takes an ox that's working for their benefit and making something and muzzles and actually hinders him in his work, but he has the right to share in blessing of the work that he's providing. And that scripture is not about the ox. It's about God's ministers and God's people to benefit from the work that they do. And then 4th, he says, even in the temple, in the Old Testament, the employees of the temple shared in the food and the sacrifices that were brought in. And so they were able to be provided for by their service and work in the temple. And so Paul gives these 4 examples why it's right for him to earn a living through the gospel and be provided for by it. And then right after that, he lays it down. And so he says in verse 12, nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. He gives 2 other reasons in here that are all kind of combined together. He says, that I may preach the gospel without charge. And at the end, he also says, I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. And so Paul really wants the gospel to be clear to people, not confused by what his motivations are, so that he may save some. And so he says, I'm going to be all things to all people under God's law, so that I may save some. I want to present the gospel free of charge, lest they think I have some ulterior motive in here. And so even though I have the right to earn money from it, I'm going to lay that down, and I'm going to gladly present the gospel free of charge so that some may be saved and some may understand the gospel, because his motivation 1, I've removed an obstacle. And the obstacle there was him collecting money for it. What is Paul's motivation here? And so he said, I'll gladly remove that obstacle so the gospel may be presented clearly and free of charge to those that don't know it. As Christians, we want to be mature. We want our knowledge and our love to grow together. And so as we grow in maturity, we're going to better understand the gospel and the liberties we have, the freedoms we have in that gospel, but we also should be more ready to lay down those freedoms. And so we have right to use our freedoms, but we're also free to not use our freedoms. Paul doesn't say, woe is me if I do not use all of my Christian freedoms. But he says, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. Woe is me if I don't love my neighbor. And so that is what Paul is shooting for here. He's saying, I have these liberties and I'm so ready to lay them down because I'm commanded to love. I'm commanded to preach. And these liberties are a small thing to me, things to be enjoyed. But just as I'm free to use them, I'm free to lay them down as well. And last thing I want us to think about here is, in this, our love is to be genuine. And so Paul wants to love his neighbor, and he wants to love his neighbor genuinely. And so you may say, all things to all people, do I flip-flop back and forth? And actually, Paul's motivation here is really consistent. His actions at different places and what he says and how he applies it is going to look different. With some, that means eating. Some with it means abstaining from eating. Some it may mean drinking with. Some it means abstaining from drinking with. But his motivation is consistent all the way through, that he says, I need to preach the gospel and I need to love my neighbor. And so he applies, that's his goal. That's what he's shooting for. And he applies it in a handful of different ways. And so with certain people look this way, certain people look this way. And he says, I'm trying to remove all the obstacles so that all it is the gospel that they see. There's no unnecessary barrier of my ungodliness or my lack of loving them that gets in the way here. And so he says, let our love be genuine. And so that doesn't mean if someone doesn't like something, you're like, oh yeah, I don't like that either. Or someone really likes biking, for a simple example, and you're like, oh, I love biking. And they're like, how often do you go? And you're like, I haven't gone for 6 years. That's not genuinely loving people and being all things to all people. But there are ways to genuinely love people and move towards and cater to their preferences or their weak consciences so that you may love them better. And so it doesn't mean your conscience is bound as theirs. Your conscience is free, and you willfully lay down these rights for their benefit. So just because they think something is wrong doesn't mean you have to agree with them and say it's wrong, but you say, for your sake, I will guard your conscience and care for it in that sense. Even though I'm free to do whatever, I'm also free to lay down that liberty for the sake of loving you. And so may we grow in maturity and knowledge and in love as Christians, and may we be all the more eager to lay down those liberties that we have for the sake of the gospel as Paul shows us here in 1 Corinthians 9.